Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in our series on the history of bad ideas, I'm talking to the political philosopher Alan Finlayson about what is both a very broad idea and also a very specific recent application. The big idea is behaviourism. The specific application is what's come to be known as nudge. The view that our politics would go better if you just tweak the background conditions of the choices that we all make. Alan and I will explore where that idea came from and why some of the problems with it go right back to the beginning. Alan, we're talking about a subject today, behaviourism, which both refers to a very broad field of the human sciences, psychology, psychotherapy, and other things too, within which there is some thinking about politics. But politics is probably a subset of that broader idea of behaviourism. And then we're going to talk about a version of it, which has become fashionable more recently and has a much less sciencey sounding name, which is nudge, and the ways in which it's believed that people can be nudged into behaviours that are either good for them or good for society. And we'll come on to that. But it's probably best to start with the broader category of behaviourism and get a sense of what it is that we're talking about. And people may not be that familiar with the history of behaviourism. I'm not, but like me, they've probably heard of at least one famous behavioural experiment. If not the man himself, then his dog, or both, Pavlov's dog, which is right at the end of the 19th century, I think. I think the results were published in 1897. The famous experiment that Pavlov conducted when he fed his dog or put food in front of his dog, and the dog salivated, as dogs do, and at the same time he rang a bell, and he progressively put less and less food in front of his dog and eventually no food in front of his dog, but carried on ringing the bell. And by the end of the experiment, ringing the bell made the dog salivate, even if there was no food. I don't think I've simplified the experiment too much. I think that's pretty much what it is. Is that a fair picture of what behaviourism is? That it's, obviously there are lots of variants on this, but at heart, it's the idea that external stimuli can trigger responses, even if those responses seem to have very little to do with what we think those stimuli would require of us.
I think that's a perfectly fair place to start, partly because people probably have heard of Pavlov's dog. And behaviourism is partly interesting, I think, because it's one of those things that although many of us are not experts in it, we've sort of heard of it and maybe even unwittingly used some of its language and used some of its concepts. So I would say it is, on the one hand, exactly what you describe. It's a particular way of thinking about how people respond to stimuluses, but it's also, I think, importantly, a method. It maybe wouldn't call itself a theory. It's a proposition that if we want to understand things, animals, but also people, then we shouldn't go about wondering what's in their minds, what their ideas are, what their thinking is. We can instead just observe very carefully, scientifically, what their behaviour is in certain circumstances. We can do that experimentally. We can set up certain conditions and see how they respond or don't respond. And that will tell us everything we need to know. So we can do away with philosophy. We can do away with history, which might concern you, because all we're interested in is how does an organism respond. I mean, maybe history matters only in terms of how the organism has learned things over its own personal history, and therefore how that shapes its behaviour. So people know words like conditioning, for example. We become conditioned to certain kinds of things, or stimuli response. So we think about an organism or a person just in terms of what has it learned, how has that learning shaped the way it responds to various things. If we change the response, what happens then? And that's all we need to do to have a proper understanding of human behaviour.
And there is behind that an assumption that this behaviour is predictable. So this is about anticipating that future behaviour will follow the pattern of past behaviour. It's a very inductive method. It's predictable, as you say, it's experimental. So you can run experiments, including what might be very artificial experiments, and then also maybe assume or hope that when you do it in the wild, something like that will be repeated. So context, which matters in the experimental sense, gets a little bit lost because it's not so much, well, it really depends when, where, and how. It's kind of, we've established that if we get the stimuli right, we will expect these behaviors. And that idea or those ideas do then feed into perhaps the best known mid-20th century exponent of behaviorism. So the story moves from Russia to the United States. B.F. Skinner, a psychologist, experimental psychologist, who became, I guess, the figurehead of the mid-20th century behaviourist movement. Is it still recognisably Pavlovian? We've replaced dogs with people now, primarily, as the subject of these experiments. But are we still broadly talking about the same thing? And it was very fashionable in the 40s and 50s, I think, this way of thinking about the world. Is it people as dogs, to put it crudely?
Well, I'm sure its advocates wouldn't like that comparison and
No.
would be at pains to say that it's not just about dogs, it's a richer approach. And I think many of contemporary psychologists would say we've moved beyond Skinner, although I think you can see ways in which they continue in that tradition. But I think that core proposition that psychology, which of course it historically comes out of philosophy and ways of reflecting on inner experience, that proposition that psychology should be above all an experimental science that tries to provide replicable findings of behaviour with a view to predicting behaviour in some way, perhaps with a view to improving it or regulating it. I think that still continues to inform an awful lot of thinking, if not all thinking in the academy, quite a lot of general, everyday lay people's thinking about psychology, perhaps we could say. And Skinner, while in some ways a controversial figure and clearly quite a character, is a key figure in that, pushing that approach above all, that experiment is the only way you can find out what human behaviour is and how it works. It is knowable through that. So there are certain assumptions there that there are things about the human organism that are going to be regular across cases. So context might matter, but actually context doesn't matter as much as the nature of the human organism, and that will inspire later on versions of evolutionary psychology, that we've evolved to respond in certain kinds of ways and have certain kinds of behaviour patterns that, again, we can know. But I would also maybe distinguish it perhaps slightly from the sort of biological forms of behaviourism that might be trying to identify the actual parts of our neural anatomy that, when they're the same or different, manifest as very different kinds of behaviours in different kinds of people.
And one of the sciences that it then connects to, a science that's really going to come to dominate in the second half of the 20th century, is economics. And I take one of the points of overlap between that psychological behaviorism and economics is when we talk about experiments, we're not thinking of asking people how they feel. We're not thinking that what you should do, and this is not at this point anything like what we might think of as psychotherapy or that interactive way of trying to get at understanding people's behaviours. It's much more about what economists would call revealed preferences, the idea that in a way how human beings behave is revealed by how they behave, not by asking them what they think is going on. And that does seem like a strand in behaviorism, and this is going to connect to its impact on politics, which feeds out not just from psychology, but into the social sciences.
That's exactly right. A key thing to understand is that the strong claim is that people's inner states are irrelevant. They're either unknowable or they're irrelevant. We don't need to know them. So what people say about their behaviour, their preferences, is not important, only what can be experimentally demonstrated and verified. And I think people cannot underestimate the influence of that on social science more broadly and on the world through economics. I mean, I don't want to sound like sour grapes, but I occasionally hear people say that the academy has ruined the world because of cultural Marxism or gender theory, and it dominates everyone's thinking. It seems to me the reality is behaviorism and economics are the dominant sciences in the social sciences, and have had a far bigger effect on people's outlook in the world, their cultural outlook. That's what you're going to find in the magazines, is lists of questions to help you find out what your behavioural pattern is, and it's what you're going to find in the policy department. So what has happened, and part of what I think is interesting about it, is the way in which something that starts out as experiments on dogs and becomes a broader theory of how to study human behaviour has become a kind of theory of politics, a theory of how we can find out what to do in politics, a theory of what politics should or shouldn't be. And I think it also bears the imprint of Skinner's very evident hostility to politics and to philosophy and to history. He's not shy about talking about the uselessness of those particular fields. And I think it's one that's become far more dominant in people's thinking about government, or in government people's thinking about government, should we say, that maybe even they realise. And so understanding it is important not just for itself, but also as a way of, I would argue, understanding politics today. But that's me assuming that what's inside people's heads, how they think and their beliefs might be important. So the behaviourist would, of course, object.
I wanted to ask you about Skinner's view of politics, because as you say, he was quite a character. He was a public intellectual. He wasn't just an ivory tower experimental psychologist. Among other things, he was a novelist. He wrote, I think, more than one novel, but one very famous novel called Walden 2, which was I think you can call it a utopian novel. The reason I doubt it is I think some people would call it dystopian. That was my only reason for doubt. But certainly I think he didn't see it that way. And, people's utopian visions are helpful for trying to understand how they think the world ought to be. How would you characterize the vision that you get from Skinner, say, in the novel called Walden 2? What is his ideal behavioural community?
Well, let's just pause and think about the fact that he's called it Walden 2. So he's harking back to Henry David Thoreau's book about going back and living in the woods and living a simple individual life, not dependent on anything.
Yeah, crucially, a solitary life.
Exactly. And in a way, Walden 2 is sort of trying to be the opposite of that. It's not a solitary life. It's a community with quite a high degree of cooperation and integration and belonging within it. But the book's also written very much in classic utopian style, just as in Thomas More's Utopia, people come to an island and get shown around and have things explained to them. That's what happens in the novel. Some people go from the university, a philosopher who's kind of the bad guy in the story, and some others go and get shown around this community by a slightly cantankerous chap who you're not really quite supposed to like, called Fraser, who goes and shows them how everything is working in this wonderful new community. The essence of it, in a way, is hard to explain, but it's an attempt to show how a society could be based on the practice of experiment. They found out the best ways to live by trying out various things that will make life better and make life work and make things work, and they only follow experiments. So it's partly designed to enable this ongoing experimentation in what will be most effective in social life. But it's also one in which people's behaviour is being continually modified and developed by the way in which the social system is organised in order to enable them to be fully socially integrated and dependent on each other and to live freer, happier lives than people do outside. So on the one hand, that includes things that seem relatively frivolous. So one bit that makes me smile in the book is that the taboo against saying you're bored is lifted. You're allowed to say to people, no, I'm bored now, I've got no interest in what you're saying. Because why should we put up with the inefficiency of these kinds of social rules? I think that maybe tells you something about Skinner's personality. And I slightly empathise with that bit as well. But there are other things in there. People don't really have to work very much. They are allotted different kinds of tasks. They maybe work 4 or 5 hours a day. They don't receive money, but they get a credit for it. And the credits, people have to have a certain amount of credits. That's just the incentive to keep them working. There isn't any kind of great accumulation of those things. And they have slowly, or the aim is to slowly develop people by what he calls in the book cultural engineering, as well as behaviour engineering, to lose some of the traits that are destructive for social life. So they're going to lose their capacity for envy, for example. Envy is trained out of them, and they learn as children how to not be envious and how to be patient and how to wait. So, for example, there's at one point, it's explained that in order to develop their patience, the children will go through what people will probably heard of, a kind of marshmallow test. Just a test where you give a child a marshmallow and you say, if you don't eat it in the next 10 minutes, you can get another one in 10 minutes. And you see which kids eat it and which kids don't. And then you infer things about their behaviour in their future. In this case, they have to stand in front of their bowls of hot soup for 5 minutes before they're allowed to eat them, so that they can learn patience and appreciation and this sort of thing. And they can lose some of their impulses and they can become directed, and they will be happier, more productive, more well-balanced kinds of human beings.
It's very interesting that I totally get the connection to the marshmallow test, but it's also completely different in the sense the marshmallow test tends to be used as a way of sorting people into categories, like do you or do you not have the ability to defer gratification? Whereas it sounds like the Skinner version is if you keep doing a version of the marshmallow test, you will educate out of people the thing that you want to educate out of them, which is not how the marshmallow test as used now is used. It's used to identify different personality types. So it is very behavioural in that sense if the thought is as part of education, if you repeat the process, presumably like Pavlov's dog, you put them in front of the soup and do it in the right way. And over time, they will learn not to want to eat it straight away.
That's exactly right. And that's perhaps part of what makes it utopian and part of where contemporary behaviourists would differ from Skinner in thinking that we can't perhaps do that. But so it does also have this very mid-century faith in the possibilities of a scientific understanding. He talks at one point about, in Walden, they're trying to develop what he calls a technology of behaviour. I'll give you the quote. He says, a technology of behaviour comparable in power and precision to physical and biological technology. So just as we've come to understand the weather and its causes, and maybe would like to be able to control it, we could come to understand the causes of our behaviour and come to improve on it, to eradicate excessive envy and excessive anger, to give people the patience and the impulse control. But again, not because there's someone at the top who has this incredible foresight and vision. I think Skinner doesn't think that's what he's proposing. It's a community devoted to the endless perfection of itself through the application of the experimental method on behaviour. And as part of that, his sort of challenge to politics, or to people like us, political theorists, is that we need to get rid of our political theory concepts. He writes a book subsequently called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, which is essentially arguing that we need to get beyond our concepts of freedom and dignity because they get in the way. Not because people shouldn't be free or shouldn't have what we call dignity, but because we're so fixated on a certain idea of freedom that we think that control is by definition a bad thing. Whereas we need to understand that actually rational, scientifically, experimentally proven control can be helpful and beneficial to us, and that actually what human beings or political theorists called freedom was just a way of describing or expressing a hope for a certain kind of behaviour, not being impeded in certain ways, rejecting the behaviour of others towards us, for example. And that, again, what we call dignity was a way of trying to shape behaviour by saying there were certain things that we should and shouldn't do. So we should move beyond that to have a different kind of language that isn't so freighted with moral or philosophical and therefore also unscientific meaning, and have a society that can help us move beyond those to achieve a kind of perfectibility.
So is that a moving beyond politics altogether? I mean, is Walden, as conceived by Skinner, it's not anarchic, clearly, but is it a politics-less society in some way?
I think he thinks that it is. I think we might disagree when we read the book. It opposes itself to politics very directly, where what it means by politics is something like mid-century American electoral politics. And unsurprisingly, the characters in the novel are hostile to that because it's irrational. It's just a game.
It's asking people what they think.
It's asking people what they think. It's maybe a crude way of trying to manipulate what people think, but to no necessarily very good end. You've selected people to take on certain jobs, but not by any scientific criteria. So he's very clear. He says he's rejecting despotism. His utopia is not despotic. In fact, it's trying to free itself from the despotism of democracy, as well as other kinds of despotism. So it's very hostile to government and to politics for the reasons that many people are hostile to government and politics. It's just a bunch of people showing off, trying to acquire power for their own ends, not really thinking through how to do things properly, etc. So why not replace those with a system that is, from his point of view, not a politics, because it excludes all of that. It is, of course, a politics, and there is a theory there about how society should be organised. There is a theory about how decisions should be taken. It does allocate power to decision makers and to planners, but they maybe only serve that role a little while, and they're not there to have any long-term power. There's fragments of other utopias that people might be familiar. The Platonic utopia is one that is run by philosophers who are disinterested in acquiring power and wealth, but just thinking about the nature of eternal and moral truths. In a way, this is like that. It's just that the people are, all of them, dedicated behavioural scientists, and there's no presumed division between different classes. Everybody is going to be free in the sense that they're allocated to the places that are going to be best and able to develop them, and they will not feel constrained by their own bad impulses. In the sense, it's freedom from your own negative impulses, because you've got a society that helps adjust you. And all the things that would get in the way, like greed and envy and money and market competition and political desires for power, are all gone.
What's so interesting about it, just hearing that description of it, it feels like it's the bridge between two things that might seem like they're very distant from each other, but actually have a lot in common. So from Thoreau and Walden to Silicon Valley, in the sense that, on the one hand, as described, it sounds quite hippy-dippy. It's a little community. there is a sense not of anarchic instincts, but certainly a breaking free from certain kinds of shackles, a getting rid of some of the ways in which we're gripped by the social norms and expectations into which we're born. It's a small community, it's an island, it's people doing their own thing. And yet it also sounds a lot like contemporary Silicon Valley ideology to do with the ways in which people can potentially, by clever, smart, experimental designers, be steered towards behaviors that will leave them happier and better off. And the thing that from Thoreau to Silicon Valley that they have in common is they don't like politics. Or at least in Thoreau, there is that civil disobedience desire to reject the crudeness, the moral crudeness of the state. He goes into the woods to be by himself, to commune with nature. It's a getting away from, among other things, late 1850s American politics, which he cannot bear. He can't bear being implicated in it. He can't bear that it's being done in his name. Through to 21st century Silicon Valley ideology, where there's a thought that this kind of thinking could emancipate us from the crudeness, the crassness, the inefficiencies of the state. It almost feels like Skinner is the bridge from Thoreau to Peter Thiel.
I would completely agree. I think that's an absolutely excellent point to draw. And I hope that's not just me describing Skinner in a way that resonates with my experience about the contemporary situation. But I think it's a hostility to democracy that is not necessarily, at least not in its own self-conception, about authoritarianism. It's just that democracy is messy, backward-looking 19th century way of doing things. It's an embrace of technology, of scientific knowledge and understanding that we can use to improve things, whether that's our energy supplies or our biological well-being. But it's also, I think, more than that, it's also embodied in some of the aspirations of Silicon Valley technology. Shoshana Zuboff, the Harvard Business School writer, who's very hostile to what she calls surveillance capitalism, to the Silicon Valley social media enterprise, she coins rather an ugly term. It's instrumentarian power. But that what she sees coming out of Silicon Valley and in the social media platforms is a machine that is designed, as it were, to monitor and measure and experiment on people's behavior, to see what they respond to, what they don't respond to, what makes them keep watching, what makes them stop watching, what will affect their behavior in certain kinds of ways. And of course, from her point of view, I think correctly, they're doing that primarily to acquire revenue, to generate income. But Silicon Valley people might say they're also doing that to try and understand human beings better and make things better for us. I remember seeing social media company people say we can predict pandemics and flu outbreaks before the medical sciences can, because we can see what people are searching and looking for. We can predict riots, perhaps. We can see sources of potential disorder. And that gives rise to a much broader theory of government in a way. Well, we've got a technology where we don't need to have the crude mechanisms of political party meetings that pass votes and have decisions that get referred to conference, that get put to some national vote, that get debated in a noisy parliament. We can just find out what people are thinking and feeling, and then we can respond to that in an appropriate way. And I think that's a vision of government that is in fact shared across what's left of our political spectrum in different ways, perhaps for different reasons, and is at the core of a lot of what is happening to us right now.
So to get from Skinner to what you just described, and what you just described is going to include the thing that gets called nudge on the political end, not the Silicon Valley end, things happen to behaviourism. So my understanding is it is the case that Skinner fell out of fashion quite dramatically. His bombastic, public intellectual, to be honest, overstated version of this was discredited. The leading figure in discrediting it was Noam Chomsky. This is Noam Chomsky, cognitive scientist, not Noam Chomsky, crusader against the neoliberal warmongering American state, though those two things are connected in some way I don't fully understand. But Chomsky was behind what I think is called the cognitive revolution, which essentially is the turn in psychology to saying thinking does matter. What goes on inside does matter. The way the brain works does matter. And there were many, but one of the, this is a very simple one, but one of the counter-arguments, you might say, proofs against Skinner's version of behaviourism was Chomsky's point, which is so simple but so appealing, that if it was true that children respond to what's around them, children would never say, which almost all children learning English do say, the word sheeps as the plural for sheep, because They would never hear adults saying that. It's not around them. The reason they say sheeps is because grammar is hardwired in our head in various ways. So what's going on in there really matters, and actually matters more than simply we are responding to the things that come in from the outside. What comes in from the outside is the word sheep, but what comes out is the word sheeps in children until they are told that's wrong. And that's not behaviourism, that's just education, which is different, I think. And the cognitive revolution persuaded almost everyone that you can't, in the way Skinner might have liked, ignore the inside of people's heads. And then over the following 2 generations, there was a complicated negotiation between behaviourism and cognitive thinking that produced, among other things, CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, which both takes account of the behavioural and the cognitive. And so behaviourism, almost by definition in this process, got softened from the Skinner version. It became more accommodating of the ideas of what went on inside people's heads. But it also started to get very interested in what are called cognitive biases, which are the ways in which human beings respond irrationally, you might say, or surprisingly, or just predictably, but not helpfully, to certain situations. We all have a whole range of biases that come out from the inside of our heads. We are short-termist, we are loss aversion. If you do the Wikipedia list of cognitive biases, there are now thousands, probably, of them, all with different names, but they all refer to the ways in which our thinking conditions what we do and what we say and the choices that we make, because we are conditioned often to think in ways that aren't in our best interest. And that then does open the door to a new kind of behaviourism, which is working with the cognitive biases to produce the outcomes that we might desire. Is that how we get to nudge? I'm not completely clear how we get to nudge, but it feels like that is a big part of it, which is there having been this cognitive revolution, but it, among other things, revealing all of these cognitive biases. It provides fertile ground for a new kind of thinking about how to shape human behaviour.
I think that's a big part of the story, but you're missing a part of it. So let's just go back. So yes, opposition to Skinner comes in part from those who think that we have a soul, for example, and Skinner isn't interested in our soul. So there are kind of theological and cultural objections to it. But the one that really matters, as you say, is Chomsky, pointing out that part of Skinner's system is that really we're very much blank slates, and therefore we are potentially perfectible. And although Chomsky isn't expressing it like that, what he's saying is that we're not blank slates. The capacity to acquire language is innate. It is going to come in certain ways. It doesn't really matter how we're behaviourally trained and so forth. So there are limits. And that's a really important shift in this when it comes to how it plays out politically, because it's no longer going to be Skinner's utopian version of ultimate perfectibility. It's going to be something, I hesitate to call it conservative, but I only mean conservative in the sense if we think conservatism implies some view about the imperfectibility of the human species, its fallibility. Again, which isn't quite what Chomsky is saying, but it's what it opens the way to. Now, what's important is when that meets economics, because at this point, economics, post-war economics, particularly in the States, has become very focused on not how you make widgets or pig iron into girders. It's become focused on choice. It's begun to make itself into a science of choice. How do people make choices, and how can we measure and model their choices in order to understand and predict initially economic behaviours and other kinds of behaviours? So the assumption there is that actually people are always trying to be rational, in the sense that they're always trying to maximise their advantage, to get more for less, put less energy in to get more of something out. They're ranking their preferences and acting in ways designed to produce the perfect outcome. What's happening with cognitive behaviourism is it's saying, well, actually, people are not always rational. They make decisions too fast. They make decisions based on tendency to be lazy, for example, to not put all the work in reading the small print. They might be swayed by certain things in the situation. So you mentioned various of those cognitive biases. One of them is called anchoring. The first bit of information you get is going to shape your way of thinking about something and affect how you interpret subsequent information. And you can experimentally show that if you vary what bit of information comes first, a different thing anchors your understanding of the situation and so affects the way in which you make choices.
Or alternatively, the other one, which is the last thing that's happened to you, is the thing that will shape you. Because there are those famous experiments where people are subject to quite unpleasant medical procedures. But if it ends with a couple of minutes where it's not so painful, they remember it as much less painful. And restaurateurs, some have interpreted that to think that pudding is more important than the starter. It goes in lots of different directions, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's lots of things. Yeah, the framing of your arguments, for example, or the ways in which choices are presented. So there are all these different kinds of cognitive biases. And for the economists, they can be really important because if you want the economy to run well and run efficiently, as you understand that term, then you want people to be making rational choices. And then there is some kind of more perfect market competition. But if you find repeatedly, which is what behavioral economists do, that people tend to be more concerned about losing money than making money, so they would rather hold on to what they have than risk losing some of it in investments, even if that investment is very likely to pay off, you've got a finding there experimentally that the economy isn't going to be working as well as it should. So now you've got a different way of thinking about how to apply behaviourist methods, experimentally verified, to the management of an important part of society, which is the economy. We've got to shape the way in which people exercise their choices. We've got to make them better at being rational utility maximisers. And that can then inform forms of government regulation, that can inform broader policies towards managing and regulating markets. But it's focused not on the economy as the Keynesians might have understood it, the macro level of demand and supply. It's based on the individualized level of decision making. And that's how we're going to make things better. And it's now then, even for people who are, on the one hand, very opposed to government regulation of the economy, it becomes a means to regulate the economy. If the economy is dysregulated, we don't want interventionist government policies, we want better market actors. So government needs to apply itself to creating systems which improve people's decision making. So then you get, and this is where it comes to nudge, you've got an idea of choice architecture. How are you designing and presenting the choices so that people will make the best choice? Which may not mean telling them what it is, it just means shaping it and framing it so they can make the best choice. And people can see that in various things in their daily lives. For example, it's a well-known fact that people don't change their energy supplier. We're lazy about it and we get stuck in a habit, even when the energy supplier, another one might be cheaper. So how do we change that? Well, we make it so that you get an email that says your tariff is changing. If you go on this website, you can compare with other companies. You make it more simple, less of a cognitive burden for people to change their energy supplier. And your expectation is that doing that is going to make energy supply more efficient and the market system better and lead to overall optimal outcomes for everybody. Do that rather than do anything like regulate the price of energy or regulate through taxation anything that energy companies have to do.
Behavioral economics, again, it's a lot of this is academic and it's arguments fought out in the academy, but it does transcend that. The best known behavioral economist, probably recently deceased, Daniel Kahneman, and he wrote a book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which was a huge bestseller. A lot of people may have read it. And it's interesting because it's about thinking. So it is this hybrid. It's the cognitive behavioral hybrid. And as you said, you used the word cognitive just then to describe this new kind of behaviorism. So it's not that they're no longer interested in what goes on inside people's heads, very interested in how it works in there and trying to understand the way that human beings' brains mislead them and confuse them and all the rest of it, but anchored to this experimental method. And in a way, it is, for that reason, perhaps more powerful than the Skinner version, which did partly, I think, break down by him being so dogmatic about being on one side of that divide. And Daniel Kahneman's writing for a popular audience is very accessible. It's very human, quite sort of humanistic in a way. It feels like it's very interested in what makes us us and how we think about ourselves and understanding our own thought processes. But it's also a pretty hard-edged experimental science. And he did famously win the Nobel Prize, not for peace or for literature, but for economics.
Yes, I think I might push back slightly because I think that it's interested in what's going on inside people's heads, but I don't know if it's interested in ideas as we might understand them.
So it's thinking in a particular sense.
Yes. So I think it's still got that sense of We have an organism. The organism responds to its environment in various ways. We need to understand how it does that. And I think it, in a way that perhaps Skinner might have approved of, it converts ideas into part of the choice architecture. Your values are not to be understood as moral beliefs that might have some existence or validity that could be debated and discussed independent of you. They are just what happen to be your preferences, your beliefs about how things should and shouldn't work. And it's not a concern for this field to make those ideas right or wrong in themselves. It's there to understand how those shape your behaviour. So it can still be about revealed preferences. And maybe understand that the preference is revealed because you happen to be somebody who has a particular cognitive bias towards equality or inequality. You happen to be someone who is very open to others, or you happen to be someone who is very nervous about others and about different sorts of people. They might be expressed as values. We might have an everyday language that treats them as beliefs, but actually they're just impulses, should we say. That's not how they would say it, that's my term, that happen to be part of what shapes the behaviour of particular people. So we can take account of those in designing our policies, in designing our choice architecture so that people will behave in certain ways. And what's important about that from the point of view of politics is that that means we don't need to have an argument or a debate or a vote about what sort of decision you should make. Should you be more or less prejudiced? That moral discussion isn't necessarily important. What's important from this point of view is how does that play out in your decision making? And if we want to change your decision making, how do we present things or stage them so that you make a decision that has the outcome that is preferred?
Still interesting that, say, that Kahneman book, I think it was primarily marketed as self-help. And self-help is an interesting category because on the one hand, it seems to promise a kind of self-knowledge. And I've read that book, and like a lot of people who read that book, I felt at the end of it, I'd sort of understood myself a bit better. I can't now remember what it was I understood about myself better, but it gives a brief glimpse or illusion of a certain kind of self-knowledge. And on the other hand, it's not about self-knowledge at all. It's about treating yourself like a experimental subject and making sure you learn better about the kinds of situations in which you're more likely to make better choices rather than coming to a deeper understanding of your strengths and weaknesses, your values, your all the rest of it. These things are all these slightly weird hybrids in that they can almost be packaged as something once we've gone through the cognitive revolution that is sensitive to that longer tradition of what it is to be a human being trying to think in that broader sense about the meaning of our lives. And yet we're not a million miles away from Pavlov's dog.
I think that's really interesting. I think it's interesting for two reasons, because partly because we could go back and look at the history of philosophy and say that actually at some level it appreciates and already understood something that the behaviourists have made apparent. So in ancient Greece, in Plato, we find people worrying about what they call acrasia, which is why do people do things that are bad for themselves, even when they know it's bad for themselves? What is it that draws people astray? And one way of thinking about philosophy, certainly at that time, is philosophy is a series of exercises for you to undertake in your thinking and your orientation towards yourself and your body so that you can control your passions in particular ways and think in longer term about what you want to do and live a different sort of life. And in some respects, I think, yes, behaviourism can be seen in that tradition, although now it calls itself self-help. And it can be quite appealing because I'm not, in a way, not necessarily saying that it's all wrong. I understand perfectly well that if I have too many sweets in the house, I'm going to eat them and make myself sick. So I understand that I don't buy the sweets, or if someone does, I get them to hide them from me, as if there's two people in myself battling with each other and one is trying to exercise a control over the other. The short-term thinking is being controlled by the long-term thinking, which the Greeks would probably describe as rival chariot drivers controlling different horses, competing for control of my soul. So I think that's one thing to note and to think is interesting, because it might suggest to us that in fact behaviourism is not quite as free of the influence of the history of ideas as it might want to imagine itself to be, and that shapes itself, but also then to observe where it's different, which is, firstly, and I think this is part of its appeal, it dispenses with the critical moral language that we might associate with philosophy. I don't need to feel ashamed at my impulse to consume all the sweets. I'm not greedy or gluttonous. It's just a particular cognitive bias that I have. I could maybe explain it. Maybe my parents weren't nice to me and just gave me sweets when I was upset and I'm looking for emotional comfort. Maybe that's what it is. I could put it in any language, but all that really matters is that that language enables me to then be conscious of it and think about it differently and behave differently, or to create the context in which I can think about it differently. Or it enables government, if government is concerned about obesity rates, for example, but doesn't want to be seen to be moralising or interfering too much in our autonomy, to say, well, okay, what we'll do is we'll require that the calorific rate of particular foods is put on the menu in the restaurants, or there are traffic lights on the labels of the food in the supermarket, or that, and this is a real example, we will put apples by the cash register in school canteens because that will increase people's consumption of fruit. So you've evacuated a moral language, and one question might be, does that matter? Is that a problem? Maybe it's not if we get the same kind of outcome. But also, have we avoided an important philosophical conversation about something important, about why we think about eating and what the point of it is and how we relate to food in the world and all sorts of philosophical questions that Skinner would say are irrelevant, and I suspect, I don't want to put words in the mouths of Nobel Prize winners, but I think they might also think that way, even though someone like Kahneman and other behavioural psychologists do talk about morality, but they talk about morality as something that is part of a behavioural pattern that we can understand and map and measure and see how it's scattered across the population and so forth. Some people might worry that something is lost if we talk about morals or political ideas like freedom and dignity as just kind of behavioural manifestations.
And as you said earlier, this approach, this new kind of behaviourism, let's call it the nudge approach, it does also very much put the emphasis on individuals and their behaviours rather than the behaviours of other kinds of things, say corporations. I mean, you can have a behaviourism of corporations and you can have a nudge for corporations, but you have to think quite hard about how corporations behave, which this kind of economics tends not to want to do in the sense it wants to disaggregate. But not just corporations, economies, systems, the wider context, not just the immediate individual context in which choices are made, in which choice architecture happens. So if we talk about what might be wrong with nudge, and it has its passionate advocates and its passionate critics, it's not a non-controversial idea by any means, and I think the advocates are very well aware of the criticism. So Cass Sunstein, the leading philosopher in many ways of the nudge approach, writes a lot about his deep understanding of why people hate it. I mean, he's always at pains to say he's not at all oblivious, so almost trying to be the opposite of Skinner. He's probably trying to be the anti-Skinner in that sense and not be a kind of bombastic public intellectual, but be a very self-aware public intellectual. And he knows that for many people it has echoes of paternalism. It sounds manipulative. It sounds like there's an elite class of people who are setting the choice architecture and they're doing it because they don't trust ordinary people to decide for themselves. All of that. And yet he says, despite all of that, the balance is still in favour of nudge, and he gives a range of reasons. So I'm going to run these by you and see what you think. So one of which is he thinks that objecting to this kind of, let's call it soft behavioural nudging of the choices that people make, to object to that is like objecting to the air that we breathe, because it happens everywhere all the time, in personal relationships, in commercial relationships, in educational relationships. It's sort of how human beings have always interacted with each other. So it would always be a mad self-denying ordinance for government to issue it on the grounds it's got somehow higher standards and let it just happen everywhere else. What do you think of that argument?
I think I would apply my political academic approach to it and say, what have you actually claimed there? If it's something that happens anyway, maybe we should think about how politics already happens. To what extent is politics already something that has developed in some way to deal with the ways in which human beings behave, with the ways in which things can go wrong, with the ways in which we can make decisions in the wrong sort of way? Maybe politics has had something quite useful to say about that sort of thing. It's not news to political philosophers that people can be swayed by the desire to exercise power over each other, or they can be lazy, or they can be envious. We kind of knew that. And it's not news to politics that people can make the wrong decisions if they make decisions too quickly or with inadequate information. So one of the things that we evolved over time as a species was procedures for doing that. procedures for having debates. We might hate the British Parliament, for example, but at the core of the British Parliament, or the House of Commons, is quite a good idea, which is to say, if someone's going to make a proposition, have somebody say the opposite and see what the counter case is. That's a way of slowing down our thinking and making sure we're considering different kinds of options. Now, this is what maybe I sound terribly traditionalist. Would it be wise to junk that because someone's popped up and said, I did an experiment on people's Apple purchasing habits? So my concern would be, well, if it happens anyway, what you're really saying is people make lots of choices and they don't always make ideal choices because they don't always make them in constrained circumstances. Actually, we've got some ways of thinking about it. And maybe those ways of thinking about it are important and an important part of the ways in which we go about things. And if we stop doing that, if we got rid of Parliament, we might lose something that is important in our thinking about politics.
I remember at some point reading about the United States Constitution and the thinking of the people who drafted it. And like a lot of people, I find it a slightly absurd document and it increasingly looks like it doesn't really work. But suddenly thinking, but what is completely clear here is even though none of these people had the language of cognitive biases, they were definitely thinking that the job of politics was not to work with the grain of our cognitive biases, but get better outcomes, but just to push really hard against them. Human beings have a tendency to rush to judgment, so let's slow the damn thing down. The result of that will be human beings who have a tendency to rush to judgment will be frustrated by this system. They will probably express their dissatisfaction with it. Fine, that's a sign that the system's doing okay because it's actually pushing against the tendency of human beings to make mistakes because of the ways in which they think. And it feels a little like, without wanting to defend the United States Constitution, that the nudge approach gives up too easily on the thought that the job of politics is not to understand our cognitive biases and work with the grain of them, but in such a way as to benefit us. So we know people make short-term choices, so you put the choices in front of them that if they were to make a short-term choice, surprise, surprise, actually the outcome would be in their long-term interest because we've tweaked the terms of the offer. But actually to frustrate them. Again, I don't want to sound too much like a traditionalist, but I think democratic politics is meant to be really annoying. That's one of the ways in which you know it's not just about human behaviors. It's about trying to go beyond that into a space in which people might be forced to argue it out.
No, that's exactly right. To require people to justify their positions to each other. And again, we could convert that somehow with the language of behaviourism, but I think we would miss the point that that was about trying to transform preferences and preference sets. But also, I think this is also recognised in the US Constitution, as in other constitutions, that part of the problems we face in politics are not just down to our cognitive limitations. They may be down to limitations of us as human beings, I suppose you could say, but not just cognitive limitations, and that they can't all be addressed simply by having us change the ways in which we make our decisions or changing our inner psychology. So again, to push back on Sunstein's day, I think that we lose something if we substitute the language of choices and preferences for the language of something like interests. That in fact, the way our society is organised, people have particular kinds of interests, which are at one level irrational maybe, but also rationally explicable, and that the conflicts between people aren't to do with their different beliefs or different preferences, but because the way the world is organised, somebody wants something that somebody else wants and they can't both have it at the same time. And so what matters there is how we resolve that dispute and that conflict between them, how we surface that conflict, recognise it as a conflict in which both parties might have a point. We don't just say, but this one's king, so he gets to boot you off and take your land. We have some way of resolving that. And I think that's, for me, would be the essence of politics and part of the genius of politics and precisely why it's annoying, because it recognises that we've got different interests and they aren't going to be resolved. We're not all going to be happy. But also that the solution to them can't just be having somebody acclimatise to them. To take a real example, the British university system is under great financial pressure. I don't know if I'm going to keep my job for as long as I would like to keep my job. I would object very strenuously if I was told by somebody who'd done the experiments that that's because I'm a certain age and my neural architecture is a little bit slow and stuck and I'm resistant to change. And so I need to work on myself to be able to accept changes in my employment and financial situation and adjust myself to it. I should adjust to the world. I think, no, there's a conflict there of my interests with the interests of other organisations, institutions, agencies, taxpayers and students in the country. And that's got to be resolved in some different way. Not necessarily to my advantage, that wouldn't necessarily be the outcome, but some recognition of that fact and of the legitimacy of my claim against other people, which might also be important just in itself in terms of my recognizing that, yes, I have some stake in this society and it has some stake in me, and I feel that it respects my freedom and dignity insofar as that's possible. Now, again, Skinner might say, oh, that's really just a term for shaping your behaviour. I would say, no, again, that's a societal political system in which I can feel that I have some stake and some chance and some opportunity to improve my position by working alongside others to make my demands. And I would even, since I'm kind of on a roll here, say not being able to do that perhaps does induce all sorts of terrible behavioural outcomes if people feel cut off from their political system, unable to articulate with others a reasonable demand and to feel that that demand has been heard in some way and feel that there are interests working against them but are not able to express that, we might end up with a politics that is characterised by widespread distrust of states and governments, by a rise in conspiratorial thinking, and by all kinds of unpredictable sectarian and quite vicious political behaviour, if one can imagine what that might look like.
I also feel about Sunstein's argument that it's happening anyway. And his version of that, to be fair to it, is it's happening anyway, but progressive enlightened government can do it better. There's a lot of this going on out there, but the point is, what's the point of government if it doesn't aspire to take human behaviours and allow them to be conducted in a way that is better or fairer? I'm sure he'd be very happy to use the language of fairness and justice. And my instinct, particularly, say, in a time like now, 2025, it's not just it's happening anyway. There's more of it happening all the time, and it's becoming ubiquitous, and we're living in information and consumer environments in which the level of nudging is off the charts. And I feel like one of the jobs of government is to push back against that. And not to do it better, not for government to do it better or fairer than Amazon does it, but to stop Amazon from doing it. Because I think this is partly about the volume of this. And we are now in an age where just the opportunities for this kind of, even if well-intentioned, and a lot of it is not well-intentioned, but even if well-intentioned, behavioural nudging is so vast that for government to join in too feels to me a little bit like a betrayal, actually. And I don't know if I would have thought that 25 years ago, but I feel it now. And I feel it's part of the ways in which government has been co-opted by not just an approach to behavioural science, but an economic system which is based on advertising, which is what the new social media economy is based on. And I want my government to say no to that, not to say we can do it better.
So I think that touches on perhaps part of the story that we didn't really talk about, which is the connection between advertising and certain forms of or ways of thinking about behaviour, let's call it that rather than call it behavioural psychology, and the growth from that of what's sometimes called social marketing, which is the idea that we can use techniques of advertising in order to generate positive, pro-social outcomes. But what that neglects is exactly what you're saying, which is maybe we need to think about power, which is not a word that I think occurs very much in Skinner anyway. I don't know about everything Kahneman's written. That, yeah, we live in a world in which these techniques we're talking about are not just known by a few academics at Chicago or the University of East Anglia. They are widely known by advertisers. They're also widely known by many of the rest of us in different ways. And so we live in a world in which what matters is not who's got the best ideas for shaping behaviour or the best understanding, but who's got the most platforms through which to push certain choices or shape certain kinds of behaviours. And I think that your point that, well, why doesn't government do something about this is an important one for also understanding why something like nudge has taken off in the first place in government. Because in the UK case, for example, you could say it's present at various points, but it's introduced into government by New Labour towards the end of the New Labour stint in government, introduces something called the Behavioural Insights Team, which is in the Cabinet Office and is there to advise on making policy that will incorporate nudge into it as a way of shaping behaviours in pro-social ways. Now, we might ask, why is that attractive to government? Why is it attractive at that time? Perhaps you want to do a behavioural analysis of them. And I would suggest it's partly because government is so complicated that people are attracted by what seem like simple solutions, especially cost-effective solutions, ways to solve complex problems like obesity by introducing these policy measures, but also because government, maybe it lacks confidence or maybe it lacks power, doesn't quite feel able to say to junk food marketing firms, stop doing it, we're going to pass a law against you. So, in that sense, to explain the emergence of behavioural change policies at the centre of government policy isn't just about the extent to which they're experimentally proven, it's also to do with a change in the way in which people in government understand their own capacities and their own activities. And they've already given up on certain measures for shaping the behaviour of, say, some very powerful people as they exercise it over people who have less power, or their capacity to restrict those who are employing these kinds of methods in advertising and long after the New Labour government in social media and in political campaigning and so forth. So it's symptomatic of a certain, I don't want to say cowardice, let's just say a lack of confidence in politics. And that's a big problem and a question one wants to ask very carefully. What's happened to our political system that it feels it can no longer stand up to or even play a fair role in brokering between these kinds of competing interests?
And it feels like as the politics has got smaller, the problems have got bigger. And so sometimes it does feel almost absurdly mismatched. We're going to use the techniques of advertising to tackle climate change. I mean, it sort of sometimes feels that's like where we've ended up.
Yeah, precisely. Or you construe the problem of climate change as being one of, well, how do we get people to, turn off their electricity or recycle, rather than tackle what is a very difficult problem, which is how do we transform our energy supply system, which is going to involve a lot more complicated and difficult things and brokering between the interests of people who don't like their land being dug up or don't want to have to charge less for energy supply and so forth. All the stuff that politics used to consist of. And it seems to me that some of the nudge is going to always be hopelessly limited in the face of that, and reveal again the kind of utopianism at the heart of Skinner's ideal, but also perhaps the error of trying to understand all problems as simply being to do with the internal choice dispositions of individuals rather than parts of larger social systems and social structures that provide people with interests, I would say interest on incentives that shape and drive their behaviour in certain ways. And we have some experience as human beings in devising forums and mechanisms and means for trying to balance out those interests and stage those conflicts. And if we don't stage them, in fact, we might find things not going so well.
I want to ask one last question, and it's another point that Sunstein makes. So in his defense of nudge, one of the things that he says is, if we are welfarists, that is, if we believe in improving human welfare, we can't take this out of our toolbox because it's such a crucial, and he would say increasingly skilled at this, it's such a crucial way in which people's welfare outcomes can be improved. But that begins with if we are welfarists. And one of the questions I have in a way is, does this push us to think whether we really are welfarists? Because another word we haven't used here, but this is part of a long tradition that sometimes gets called utilitarianism. It's about utility, and utility means pleasure and pain. And in the earlier versions of it, it's not called behaviourism, but the idea is that people move towards pleasure and away from pain, and that you can regulate human societies by deploying pleasure and pain in ways that get the behaviours that you want and so on. And so I found myself thinking, I don't know the answer to this, but whether actually that assumption, given we're all welfarists now, this is a tool that we need to use. Actually, what we should be doing here is questioning that assumption.
Well, I think there's two things there, isn't there? There's partly, are we welfarists, but also if we are, what do we mean? What do we think welfare is? So, I mean, it's a sort of old philosophical ploy, isn't it, to say that Sunstein's propositions about nudge and about human welfare seem to presuppose some normative claim about what our welfare is that cannot itself be justified by the propositions of nudge and behavioural psychology, I would suggest. And that's the same problem in Skinner, where he says that he doesn't believe in politics and government, just in flourishing. There's clearly some idea of flourishing there that exceeds his capacity to justify it with reference to behavioural psychology. In other words, human beings have some conception in their heads of their ultimate ends or of what a good life should be. That conflicts, of course. We have different conceptions. So are we saying that actually we don't need to have conflicting conceptions because utilitarianism has answered it for us? It's the greatest happiness, the greatest number. We just have to get there, and therefore it's legitimate for us to engineer circumstances to get there. I think we don't, and I think we don't want to embrace that, partly for two reasons. One, because I think I don't trust the people who will be making that decision, perfectly classic political objection. Who culturally engineers the cultural engineers? How and why should I rely on them or expect them to do so? But also, I think that if we are not allowed to surface that dispute over ultimate aims, our sense of what the good life is, then that will in fact have bad behavioural outcomes for us. That being able to express those and play out that dispute, even if one doesn't win, is an important part of political life. And I suppose I'd want to go further and reveal my own preferences or cognitive biases, which that I would say that part of our human welfare, much as we hate it, is politics, is our capacity to participate, I would say, as equals, in some way in having disputes about what we should do and how we should live. And that's part of what human dignity consists of. And I would say that if Skinner objects to me, say, I perhaps wouldn't say that that's experimentally proven, but I would say I think history shows us that one of the motivations people have is to be treated with dignity, to be treated as people who have some capacity for autonomous living, autonomous thinking and decision making. And they quite regularly get together and make that demand, sometimes risk their life for it. And when it is denied, the societies that deny it find themselves eventually not lasting very long. And I suppose if I was to be, I don't want to be dramatic, I might say that, again, part of the difficulty we experience in society right now is precisely that people feel that they are being induced to make choices of certain kinds and to hold certain beliefs by people who are trying to shape their choices rather than allow them to express themselves. Now, that isn't to endorse the views they have or the beliefs they have, but to say that we have to find some way to have the argument.
We have got one more episode in this series of the history of bad ideas to come, and it's another very big subject. I'm talking to the philosopher Alex Douglas about the idea of identity and identity politics. What's gone wrong with that? And then we're going to be returning to the series that we were doing earlier in the summer, Politics on Trial, picking the story up with some of the big trials of the 18th and 19th centuries, including the trial and execution of Louis XVI. Do join us for all of that. This has been Past, Present, Future.